You know what's genuinely strange about Gen X? They're often described as the forgotten generation, sandwiched between the massive numbers of boomers and millennials, and yet quietly shaping much of the world around us. Consider this for a moment. While millennials are celebrated for their tech savviness and social consciousness, and boomers for their influence and authority, Gen X seems almost invisible in popular narratives. But psychologically, they are absolutely fascinating, and understanding them offers subtle insights into human behavior, adaptation, and identity. At first glance, Gen X might appear to be just another generational label, people born roughly between 1965 and 1980. But if you look more closely, patterns in their behavior reveal a deeper story of resilience, skepticism, and adaptive intelligence. They grew up in an era of paradox, rising divorce rates, shifting social norms, and the birth of personal computing. They witnessed the rise of cable TV, the collapse of Cold War certainties, and the emergence of a digital world that would eventually transform how we work and communicate. Psychologists often describe them as highly independent yet quietly anxious about stability. This tension between autonomy and uncertainty is a defining psychological feature of the generation. Here's something worth noting. Research on personality traits across generations shows that Gen Xers tend to score high on adaptability, self-reliance, and skepticism. Cognitive psychologists suggest that these traits were likely shaped by early life experiences. Many Gen X children grew up as latchkey kids, returning home from school to an empty house while both parents worked. This experience fostered early independence, but also a need to monitor and regulate their own emotions without much adult guidance. In terms of brain development, experiences like these can strengthen the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for planning, problem-solving, and self-control. But they can also heighten sensitivity to uncertainty and social cues. In other words, their brains learned to navigate complexity from a young age, making them flexible but naturally cautious. Consider the social dimension for a moment. Unlike millennials who grew up fully immersed in social media and constant connectivity, Gen X witnessed the gradual evolution of technology. They were the first generation to experience video games, home computers, and the internet as teenagers or young adults. This gave them a truly unique perspective. They were comfortable with change, but never dependent on it. Their social networks were built more through trust, shared experiences, and selective communication rather than constant virtual validation. Some researchers call this intentional social engagement. Psychologically, this explains why many Gen Xers are exceptionally skilled at reading social dynamics. They notice patterns, pick up on subtle cues, and often prefer smaller, deeper circles of connection over large and performative networks. Now, think about the professional world. Gen X entered adulthood during a period of economic uncertainty, the rise of corporate downsizing, globalization, and rapidly shifting job markets. Psychologists studying career motivation often observe a consistent pattern. Gen Xers value autonomy and competence over titles or authority. This is partly a response to witnessing job instability firsthand, and partly an internalized lesson about personal control and resilience. They learn to trust their own judgment, which can sometimes be misread by younger or older generations as cynicism or detachment. But in psychological terms, it's actually a sophisticated strategy for adaptation. If you cannot rely on external structures, you invest in internal resources, skills, knowledge, and emotional regulation. Here's something you might not immediately realize. Their skepticism isn't directed only at the world around them. It's also about self-perception. Many Gen Xers developed what psychologists call a realistic self-schema. Unlike the overly optimistic or idealized identities often observed in millennials, Gen X tends to carry a nuanced understanding of their own limitations and strengths. They can assess risks, anticipate outcomes, and adjust their behavior without needing external validation. This reflects a subtle but genuinely powerful psychological trait. They are self-reliant, not out of arrogance, but out of quiet pragmatism. But there's a real paradox here. Despite their independence and resilience, many Gen Xers struggle with recognition and cultural visibility. Their behavioral patterns, pragmatic, understated, and self-sufficient, don't always translate into social attention. Neuropsychologists might argue that this aligns with dopamine-driven feedback loops. Humans tend to respond more strongly to visible reinforcement, And generations like Gen X, who were never trained on social media reward cycles, may naturally experience less external validation for their efforts. Psychologically, this doesn't diminish their competence in any way. It simply means they are less externally celebrated, which can feel deeply frustrating in a world that increasingly thrives on visibility. Let's reflect for a moment on identity and emotional regulation. Gen Xers often balance multiple contradictions at once: independence versus a desire for genuine connection, skepticism versus quiet hope, adaptation versus nostalgia. Behavioral studies suggest that this ongoing balancing act leads to a subtle form of emotional intelligence. They may not always express emotion outwardly, but they are remarkably skilled at reading situations, predicting social responses, and managing interpersonal tension. In families, workplaces, and friendships, they frequently act as stabilizers, people who quietly understand others without needing to dominate or perform for an audience. This skill is deeply rooted in both early life experiences and their continuous adaptation to complex social and technological changes. You might wonder, how does this generational psychology matter for understanding human behavior today? The answer is surprisingly practical. Gen X's approach to problem-solving, skepticism, and adaptability offers a valuable lens into modern stress coping strategies. Research shows that people who grew up with moderate exposure to uncertainty, like many Gen Xers, tend to develop higher cognitive flexibility, meaning they can switch strategies effectively when circumstances shift around them. Their capacity for self-reliance combined with selective social engagement reflects a behavioral model that emphasizes both internal control and strategic cooperation. In essence, Gen Xers embody a psychological blueprint for navigating a rapidly changing and sometimes unpredictable world. Here's a reflective question worth sitting with. When you look at your own behavior or that of someone in your family, could you be recognizing traces of this generational adaptation? Maybe you notice a preference for independent thinking, pragmatic problem solving, or quiet skepticism. These are not simply personality quirks. They are adaptive patterns shaped by both personal environment and broader cultural history. Understanding this helps us see human behavior not as random or fixed, but as deeply responsive and contextual. As we come to the end, it's worth acknowledging that Gen X psychology reminds us of a subtle truth about human nature. Identity, resilience, and adaptation often operate in quiet ways beneath the surface of social visibility. Not all influence is loud. Some of the most impactful behavior emerges from careful observation, pattern recognition, and strategic adjustment. In families, workplaces, and social circles, Gen Xers often serve as the connectors, the stabilizers, the thoughtful ones who anticipate complexity and adjust accordingly. Their psychology illustrates that human intelligence is not purely cognitive. It's social, emotional, and profoundly adaptive. So the next time you hear someone dismiss Gen X as the forgotten generation, consider this. They may not be the most visible, but their behavioral patterns and psychological adaptations have quietly shaped much of the modern world. Their capacity for self-reliance, nuanced thinking, and social insight holds up a mirror to our own patterns of adaptation. Reflecting on this, we come to understand that human behavior is rarely linear or dramatic. It is often subtle, strategic, and quietly profound. And in that subtlety lies one of the most fascinating dimensions of our shared psychology. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more insights into psychology, human behavior, and the patterns that shape everyday life, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and take your understanding of psychology even further.